Hey, welcome back to the channel. It is great to see you here, and today we are talking about the Canon EOS shutter modes, particularly the ones that you can find on the Canon R5C. So this video was requested from a subscriber called Prince Palmer. Not sure if he's a real prince. And he was asking to explain a little bit more about the different shutter modes on the Canon R5C. So I know shutter speed and shutter angle quite well, but let's take a look at each one individually and see what is the best setting for each different mode. So first up on the menu under shutter modes, we have shutter speed. Now, a lot of photographers will be very familiar with this. This is basically the amount of time that your shutter is open. The way it is measured is usually in fractions. So for example, you're shooting in 1/50th of a second or 1/100th of a second, and it can go into full seconds depending on the kind of photography that you're doing. But for video, we tend to keep it within a certain range of shutter speeds in order to get the best looking footage. And the best shutter speed that you want to choose depends on how you want the motion blur in your shot to appear. So for example, I'm shooting at 1/50th of a second because it is double, well, the number is doubled of the frame rate that I'm shooting. And that is a rule to get a very pleasing motion blur that keeps your footage out of the uncanny valley, so it looks a lot more natural. And if you want to keep it as simple as possible, then I would say whatever your frame rate is, double that to get your shutter speed. And this is why videographers are obsessed with ND filters. These things end up being very useful for us because we have to fix our shutter speed. So instead of using shutter speed, because we have to fix that, we have aperture, ISO, and our neutral density. This ensures that we can get good exposure as well as getting nice motion blur. And I'm just going to show you the effect that changing the shutter speed has if I quadruple the frame rate to get my shutter speed or match the frame rate. So let's take a look at both of those. So this is shooting 25 frames a second at 1/25th of a second. And as you can see, it has a little bit more blur in the motion. So this means the shutter is open for longer, so we're getting more exposure per frame. It also increased the amount of light hitting the sensor, so I had to adjust my aperture to compensate. And here I have quadrupled my frame rate to get 1/100th of a second shutter speed. This means the shutter is open for less time during the frame, and it also means I had to bump up the ISO to compensate because it meant there was less time for the light to be hitting the sensor, so a darker image. And as you can see, it looks like I have a lot more fingers because I've lost that nice blur. However, if you're shooting action scenes or something that has a lot of fast movement, this will actually be beneficial. So you might want to experiment with what your shutter speed is depending on what you're filming. Next on the menu under shutter mode, you have shutter angle. Now this is basically the ratio between the shutter speed and your frame rate, just as we talked about in the previous menu setting. Now with shutter angle, instead of having fractions to measure your shutter, we're going to have degrees. And as we mentioned before, where we had double the frame rate as our shutter speed, so when I was shooting 25 frames a second and 1/50th of a second shutter speed, when we have that 2:1 ratio, we call it a 180-degree shutter. Why it's useful for videographers to use shutter angle instead of shutter speed is that if you change your frame rate and you have shutter speed as your option on this menu, you're going to have to adjust your shutter speed to get your 180-degree shutter. Whereas if you use shutter angle, it's more appropriate for video because if you then change your frames per second, the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to match the shutter angle that you've chosen. So for example, I'm shooting in 25 frames per second.
Huzzah! A man of quality!
And I have my shutter angle set to 180 degrees. If I wanted to get some slow motion footage, I would change my frames per second to 50 frames a second to get half speed slow motion.
Huzzah!
Now, if I change that while I've got shutter angle turned on, or as shutter angle as the option, the camera will automatically set my shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. And by changing to 50 frames a second, I'll see my frame get darker. I'm going to do that right now so you can see what I'm talking about. Now note the motion blur. It should stay exactly the same even after changing to 50 frames a second. This means that no matter what I set my frame rate to, my shutter angle will always stay the same and the camera will do the calculations for me. If you keep it in shutter speed, you're the one that has to do the calculations. I'm bad at maths, so I put it into shutter angle and saves me some energy and embarrassment as I try to do the calculation using my fingers. So if you're using shutter speed and you want to change the look of the blur, you're going to have to change it to a different degree. So if you wanted to have the equivalent of 1/25th of a second shutter speed for a 25 frames per second frame rate, you're going to want to change it to a 360-degree shutter. I would recommend that you just change the settings and see what the effect is. And then you can work your way in between. So we get a lot more flexibility with the amount of blur if we have our shutter angle setting turned on. So I'm going to take it to 360-degree angle and you can see what that does to the frame. And I'm not going to adjust the exposure so you understand how the change happens. As you can see, it's much brighter and there's a lot more motion blur. So it's not ideal. We don't want too much motion blur. That's why 180-degree shutter tends to be more preferable. Let's take it to a 90-degree shutter and see what that does to the image. As you can see, it is now darker and we have that same effect that we had at a higher shutter speed. So this is good for more action-oriented stuff. 180-degree is a nice general all-purpose shutter angle to use. I'd always recommend that you experiment and see what works best with the shot or the kind of style that you like. However, the majority of filmmakers and videographers will use a 180-degree shutter most of the time. I tend to put my camera into 180-degree shutter angle and leave it. I rarely change that. I never change that. I just use ND filters to change the exposure, and that's the motion blur that I like. It looks natural, it's pleasing, so I stick with that. So if you're from a photography background, you might want to make the switch to shutter angle if your camera has that option. It just saves time when you're working with video. Next up on the shutter mode menu, we have clear scan. This is something I had to look up because I didn't know what it was. Basically, have you ever been shooting a television or a computer monitor and you get weird lines and scanning going through it? This is basically a mode that allows you to film a screen without having that banding or scanning going through the monitor. Turn clear scan on, and then you are going to set it to the hertz or refresh rate of the monitor. Generally, monitors will have this written on the back, like 60 hertz, 120 hertz. So you just need to set the clear scan setting to 120 hertz, for example, and you should get a nice, clean looking image, even though you're filming a computer screen or a TV screen. Bear in mind, I'm not really sure what it does to the exposure. The final mode is just called slow. I don't know what it does. To be honest, I can show you, but I can't explain it, and I couldn't find it in the manual. So I'll just show you anyway. Take a look. This is 1/12. This is 1/6. Got much brighter as well, so keep that in mind. And this is 1/3. I hope this gives you a good idea about the different shutter modes on the Canon EOS cinema system, in particular the Canon R5C. We have the standard shutter speed, shutter angle, clear scan, and slow. I'm quite happy to know a bit more about what clear scan does, because it's something that has always bugged me is trying to film screens and you've got that awkward issue of the scanning, so that's pretty handy to have in this camera. It's also great to be able to switch between shutter speed and shutter angle, particularly for people coming from a photography background. It means that they can use this camera quite naturally with shutter speed, although I would recommend anybody from a photography background to make the switch to shutter angle, because it's going to make your life much easier and switching between different frame rates much quicker, and you'll always get the best looking footage. And if you've ever seen footage that looks a bit weird, like it's a bit jerky or I don't know, something feels a bit odd, a bit uncanny, it might actually be because the person that shot it didn't use the right shutter angle or used a too low shutter angle. And this is often the case with drone pilots because they don't put ND filters on their drones. And they actually end up getting really jittery looking footage rather than a nice smooth looking shot. So for any drone users out there, get some ND filters and put them on your drone's camera and set your shutter speed to double your frame rate, and you will get much smoother, much better looking shots, much more cinematic shots. There's my recommendation. Set your camera to shutter angle if you have that option, and put it to a 180-degree shutter. And if you don't have shutter angle, set your shutter speed to double your frame rate. Whatever your frame rate is, double it. That's your shutter speed. I really hope you found this video useful, and maybe it might even help you get better looking footage out of your camera. And if you have any recommendations for future videos that you would like to see or questions that you would like answered, do put them in the comments. If I can't answer it or make a video about it, somebody else will step in and reply to your comment. We've seen that happen a few times already, and I'm really grateful for all the people who are contributing to that. Hopefully I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, check out some of our other videos, and I shall catch you later. Take it easy.